Welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how's it going today?
It is going fantastic today, Tim. I'm thrilled to be here once again with a couple of really great guests that are coming up. Hope everyone is doing great out there. I hope you're doing well, sir. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. I'm excited to introduce this conversation that we had with two new friends that we met at Obsessed Fest. You may have heard of them. It's Suruthi Bala and Hannah McGuire of Red Handed. Very popular podcast out of the UK. They cover true crime. We had a great time with them at Obsessed Fest back in October of 2022. Hopefully we get to see them again in 2023 at Obsessed Fest again.
But we will be seeing them at their live show, which is coming up Wednesday, April 5th in New York City. They have a whole string of North American live shows that they are doing. You can check out all of that information at redhandedpodcast.com. And the conversation today, it's lighthearted, and then it really dips into some serious stuff as we discuss the Idaho quadruple murder that happened in November of 2022.
Yeah, Suruthi and Hannah are so great to speak with. We first asked them about their friendship, about their show a little bit, and then we spoke about the Idaho 4 murders. That is the murders of Madison Mogen, Kaylee Goncalves, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. Red Handed has covered this case pretty in depth, and they did a great job respectfully as well. So I think that was one of the reasons why we spoke about it here in our conversation for Crawlspace. They know a lot about it.
And they have a lot of good insights into the mind of whoever perpetrated a crime like this brutal crime. We did record this a week ago, and since then there have been a number of updates. So if you hear something that might sound a little dated, just keep in mind this was recorded a week ago. And that's also how fast things are breaking in this particular case.
And everything that we speak about as far as Brian Kohberger goes is all alleged. He is not guilty in a court of law at this point, so we want to respect that.
And Tim, if people like what they hear in this episode, but they want to hear it without the ads, even though the ads are very useful, is there a spot that they could go to perhaps subscribe to?
You don't say. There is. You can actually subscribe these days on Apple Podcasts to Crawlspace Premium. You get every single episode of Crawlspace ad-free, and you also get our weekly bonus show, Lance. And if you don't have Apple Podcasts, but you still want to subscribe to Crawlspace Premium, you can go to crawlspace.supportingcast.fm and you can get the same product there.
And you can follow the Red Handed Podcast on pretty much every social media outlet, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. It's Red Handed the Pod. Now, I know their social media handle, Tim. I have no idea what ours is. Can you refresh my memory?
That's so weird that you don't know what ours is. You can follow us at Crawlspace or Crawlspace Podcast on social media. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. We really appreciate it.
And give us a couple of minutes. We're going to break real quick for some sponsors, and then we'll get right to the women from Red Handed.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome to the podcast, Hannah and Suruthi of Red Handed. How are you today?
Hi, Tim.
Hooray.
Hi. Yeah, we're so good. Very happy to be here.
Yeah, doing great. Finally.
You're cheering us up on a very, very cold and stormy day here in London. So thank you. Hello.
Aw, you said before we started recording that you're out of bed and not crying, so it's a win. What's going on over there?
The weather's just miserable.
Yeah.
And January is always really hard in London because it gets dark at like 3 p.m. So you wake up and it's dark, and then you go to work, and then it gets dark at like lunchtime, and then you go home in the dark. So
So your soul is just filled with darkness.
exactly.
I know the weather in a few locations across the globe. Like, you hear about the Bahamas. You understand what the weather's like in the Bahamas. I've spoken to many people in the UK. I've never really dug into what winter is like in the UK. So you said it's terrible right now. Is it snowing?
When British people say it's terrible, we mean that it's cold and grey outside and we just like to complain. That's what it means. I'll be honest.
Yeah, you can totally complain. I was just curious from my own, meteorological curiosity.
Not that interesting is how I would sum it up.
Do you like my background?
I hate it.
Hate it.
Hate it. Hate you.
I'll change it. I'll change it.
It's actually our most hated press shot of all time. It was the first shoot we ever did. We had no idea what we were doing. Somehow we think we have blasted it off the internet, but somehow every time there is a write-up of something in anything, they always manage to find that fucking
This
picture.
is what kids.
And then we have to be in bed for 3 days.
Exactly. This is
So-
why kids don't put things on the internet, because you will never get it down again.
Yeah, you do look very serious. The cycle starts all over again now.
Yeah, I'll get something new. Give me 1 second.
Well, we met last October 2022 at the fantastic event known as Obsessed Fest. How'd you guys like that?
We had such a great time. We loved it. You know, we've said this to you guys before. We came to Obsessed Fest because Patrick and Gillian asked us to, and they're just two of the loveliest people you could ever hope to meet in the podcasting community. But Hannah and I had no expectations. I fully thought probably going to just spend quite a lot of time in my hotel room because we don't know anybody there. But we had the best time. The people who were there, it was huge for a first year event. It was completely crazy. The quality of the people that were there and just how happy everyone was. It was so nice. And obviously we got to meet you, Tim, Lance, and also the lovely Jen, who isn't here.
Serious Jen. Yeah,
Serious
where's Serious Jen?
You just call her Serious Jen? Fantastic.
She's consumed by the shadows of the new podcast that she's working on called Dark Valley.
Can't wait to hear about that, actually, and how you guys are getting on with it, and listen to all of it. How's it going?
Yeah, it's going well. Yeah, it's going to be great. Hopefully out in the spring, and we'll definitely have more about that. But this isn't about that and about us, you two. Cut it out. This is we're interviewing you.
Oh, no.
Tell us about your podcast and your friendship. How did you two meet?
Well, I think it would have been 6.5 years ago now when we met each other. 7 years? I don't know.
I feel like we just guess every time we do
I think every time we get asked that question, we're just like, oh, yeah, well, it was 1924.
The good thing is we're not like a married couple where one of us knows and the other one's like, she doesn't know when we met. We don't know.
We don't know.
It was probably 6 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe 6.5 years ago.
I was living in a really horrible property guardianship in Poplar, which is not a very nice area of London. And basically, property guardianship is where you pay less rent to stop people squatting in buildings that are basically uninhabitable. And that's what I was doing.
To stop people who might make the building worse than you would moving in.
Yes. Yeah. One of my co-guardians was an American, and he was like, hey, my entire extended family is going to come over for the whole of Thanksgiving week. Won't that be fun? And then there's it's like Americans on airbeds on the landing. I had to step over his grandma to get into my bedroom. It was a nightmare.
In probably like a 500-600 square foot.
Yes, yeah,
apartment.
very extremely small. 3 of us living there anyway, and then there were children and grannies. It was awful. And then he was like, "Let's have a Thanksgiving dinner." Oh, P.S. Everyone's vegan. I was like, "Oh, fucking great!" And then another one of our frequent guests was Suruthi's childhood friend who was sleeping on our sofa at the time, and he was like, "Oh, my friend's just come back from traveling. Can she come?" And I was like, "Well, fine. There's already 1 million people in this fucking apartment, so what's one more? No problem." And then in walked this magnificent beast.
I do also have to say that the person who was my friend, who was sleeping on the sofa of a property guardianship, so not even paying rent in this horrible place that you were living in, paints me in quite a bad light. But I did not know that he wasn't paying rent. I did not know he was just sleeping on the sofa. Otherwise, I would never fucking come to that party. Jesus Christ.
I really think that the US is about 5 years ahead podcasting wise to where the UK is. So 6 years ago, I didn't know anybody who was listening to podcasts. So when I met Suruthi, she was not only listening to podcasts, but listening to the reasonably niche true crime ones that I was. It felt like this enormous revelation. And then we started talking about John Benet Ramsey at the dinner table in front of children. Then towards the end of the evening, we were like, fuck it, let's just start a podcast. And then we did.
Yeah, that is basically it.
Which sounds so unbelievable now,
does.
but that is genuinely what happened.
I would never do that now. Go to a party as someone I don't know. The only reason I knew podcasts actually was because I'd just come back from traveling. So I'd been away for about 10 months and I'd done 5 months of those 10 months on my own. So you get pretty sick pretty quickly of just listening to music. And it was actually my dad who was like, "Oh, you should listen to podcasts." And I was like, "What's the podcast?" I remember having this conversation with my dad. And I think back then, the podcast space in the UK was very much like geeky tech guys, one of whom is my dad, was listening to podcasts. And so I was like, okay. And then I discovered the magical world of podcasting. And I realized that I could sit in a hostel and download hours and hours and hours of incredible content being put out, mainly by Americans at that point, onto my phone, and then just listen on airplane mode on 27-hour buses across Asia and not feel alone. It was just such a revelation. And when I came back, I was like this little podcast evangelist. I was talking to everyone about it, but everyone was just giving me sort of blank looks until I met Hannah. And honestly, when we left that party, Did not think I would ever see her again. Didn't think I actually left and I was like, was her name Hannah or was it Anna? I can't remember. We were very drunk. You have to understand. And then we actually had exchanged numbers and we started talking. And then we went on like a podcast friendship date to a pub in East London. And we just sort of spent hours and hours and hours talking about podcasts, talking about true crime. I remember texting my friends after, like, oh, I met someone, and they were like, finally. And I was like, oh no, it's not a guy, it's a girl, and we're going to start a podcast together. A murder podcast. And then unbelievably, because we had no background at all in anything to do with podcasting, broadcasting, scripting, researching, editing, nothing at all, completely 100% no experience. I'd come from like doing economics at uni, and then I worked in the unglamorous world of conference production, and Hannah worked in musical theatre. So we really just starting completely blind. No idea what we were letting ourselves in for, but thank God we did, because now we get to do the best job ever full time. Yeah.
And so you've gone on to take over the world with your podcast, and it's fantastic. It's called Red Handed. Not only do you have a hit podcast, but you wrote a great book, and now you're touring. Tell us about your book before we discuss the tour.
Oh, well, the book was really kind of a project that came out of nowhere. We were basically planning on touring over the years of COVID. Hannah went full-time in mid-2019. And then
yes,
I went full-time in the end of 2019, like Q4 2019. And we had been working on this podcast for like 2 full years at that point. And we both had incredibly demanding full-time jobs as well. So it was just like anybody who starts a business, right? Like anybody who starts a side hustle that takes over their lives. Evenings, weekends, any spare minute commutes, lunch breaks at work, we were just doing the podcast because we started off as a weekly show. So it was really intense. And then when we were like, finally we have enough money that both of us can go full time, we did. We're like, finally we can have a life again. And then it was like March, we were in lockdown. It was just like, you couldn't make it up. It seemed completely crazy. And then the only thing we could do was the podcast. So it was, I think it actually worked out great for us, and in that it really spent 2 years making us focus on the show. But during that time we had planned all of this stuff to like go on the US tour then, but obviously all of that was like not even close to happening. So our agents at the time were like, do you want to write a book since you are locked in your house? And we were like, yes, okay. And so we decided to write this book that really was meant to be, I guess, a bit of an amalgamation of all of the things that we had learnt doing true crime for the 2 years before that. And obviously there are people that have been doing it for decades and decades before. We are not experts by any sense of the imagination. But really what we wanted the book to be about, because it evolved a lot, was the fact, and you guys know this, right? Every killer that we come across, and really we only focused on multiple killers. We weren't really focusing on like one-off killers in the book. Multiple killers that often you see people talk about them as monsters or whatever to kind of separate them from us as human beings. And what we wanted to do was kind of examine each of the things that drives a person to become a multiple killer, and how all of them are actually really human desires or traits or things that happen to all of us, but just how they become perverted in the mind of a killer. So like from chapter 1, it's myth busting about like genetics, about how there's so much misunderstanding, but the impact your genetics can have on people becoming more prone to violence or more likely to become a serial killer. Then we go into adolescence, then we go into sex, relationships. We just sort of wanted to go through all of the things that make us human, but how just a slight deviation from those things in a person could lead to somebody who is dangerous. Yeah, so we wrote that, and unbelievably it became a Sunday Times bestseller here in the UK, which was pretty cool for us. And that's it. And now it's out there. It was really special.
Really special. Also, absolutely the hardest thing we've ever done, and there's so much blood, sweat and tears in that book. It's haunted. Like it was a gargantuan task. Anyone thinking about writing one, prepare for it to take over your entire life.
Well, congratulations on the book and the success of it. I'm curious, with the analysis that you are putting into the behaviors of someone who kills, who were you consulting? Because like you said, you came from a background that wasn't psychology. Just the podcast experience, was that enough for you to feel confident to put your knowledge into words?
Yeah, sure. I think as any true crime podcaster knows, referencing the shit out of everything is the only way to cover your ass. That very much like the attitude we went into the book with. You know, we're not experts, but experts have books that you can read. You know what I mean? And they'll have a very small circle of things that they will know everything about. And so through the book, sort of skipping between lots and lots of experts, we'll be able to give them a bit more of an overview, which is what true crime podcasting is anyway.
I think that's important because people want to know these things and you have to be relatable. So if you're coming from like this steeped in education background, sometimes that can be a little bit heavy-handed. It can be a little bit dense. So I think it's important to approach it from like a very human point of view.
And I also think actually one of the benefits of people like us who do podcasting, and probably why podcasting of the type that we do is so popular, where we're not experts, we're sort of going on that journey of discovery with the listener or with the reader. A lot of people who write books, for example, who are experts in a specific field, if you are an academic expert in one specific thing, you are going to write a book that is fully geared towards and leaning towards your particular study of area being the most important thing possible in that particular case or that particular topic. Whereas for us, we didn't really have any skin in the game. Like there's no benefit to me of saying this is absolutely true when it comes to like things that are clearly can be disproven in the world of like genetics and violence, for example, because we haven't spent 16 years researching it, and it would make my entire life's work invaluable if I then said that it wasn't true. So I think being able to scrutinize different research papers, different books, different academics, different theories without having a particular tie to any of them actually is maybe, in my opinion, what makes the book or the podcast successful, because we don't care what the answer is. We're just curious. And I think people who listen are also curious. And I think they enjoy going on that journey of discovery with us, because we're not coming from a starting point where we've already made up our minds, because it's just most beneficial to us for that to be the case.
Well, yeah, and I think that really conveys the message more clearly to people who, like you said, aren't coming from it in a academic point of view. Like, we're all humans. We're all curious about things, and you need that information to be delivered in a way where you can digest it.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about your tour to the U.S. Tell us about this. You're coming stateside this March 2023.
Yeah, 15 cities. We've done 2 UK only tours, and then we just did a UK and Europe tour in October, and we really enjoyed doing it, and we're good at it. The like live performance aspect of the show is like one of our favorite things to do. And obviously the show having changed so much during COVID when we couldn't do anything. And like you guys all know as podcasters, like until you physically meet the listeners, it's really difficult to like conceptualize just how many people that there are with real jobs and cars and responsibilities and stuff. Do you know what I mean? So that side of it is really exciting. And the only show we've ever done in the States was the one we did, the live recording we did at Obsessed Fest. That's the first one we'd ever done. So we're really excited.
I need to interrupt you. I'm sorry. The show that you did at Obsessed Fest was the first show that you did live in the United States. We were there and it was amazing.
It was
so
great.
Well done.
You know, we had a great time doing it and we were really glad to be there. But I think when we do our tour shows, you know, they're
a different beast. For
2 hour, it's much more intensive. Like we have not just the slideshow, it's a proper performance. Like that's what it's meant to feel like. So yeah, we're really excited that you guys are going to be coming to see our show as well.
Yeah, it's a new show as well. We had never before seen anywhere in the world. We did think about recycling because the name of the tour is the same. It's the Empty-Handed Tour, which we did in the UK, but the show is different. And we were thinking about recycling the same show, but I genuinely think like as a performer, if you're not a little bit embarrassed by something you were doing 2 years ago, you're not growing. So like, I think it's good to like keep upping the game. And I think we really have done that. So I think it will be the best one yet.
And I do apologize for interrupting you, but I was very surprised. I'm not saying that doing a show in the United States is completely different from doing a show in the UK. You know, audiences are audiences. They're going to laugh. They're going to feel affected by, you know, the same thing if they have the same emotional spectrum. But that stage with that crowd for your first one, it's pretty daunting. So again, sorry to interrupt, but well done.
I don't know, we take it as a compliment, but no, it's not what we normally do. I think we're really looking forward to coming to the US and doing it properly in March.
Where are you coming?
We are going to Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, LA, Houston, Dallas, Denver, Chicago, Minneapolis, Royal Oak, Toronto, Washington, Philadelphia, Boston, New York.
Can you do that slower?
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
We did want to speak about the tragic quadruple homicide that happened in November 2022. The 4 University of Idaho students who were murdered, and the updates, the arrest of Brian Kohberger, who is a suspect, the only apparent suspect. From the very beginning, this case has been completely shocking. It was almost too disturbing to even comprehend at first.
Oh, 100%. When it first happened, I very much have been definitely obsessed with this case since it happened. I think with so many other cases that people cover, you can always sort of rationalize it to yourself that, well, what are the chances? That's not going to happen to me. This case just felt like so completely out of the blue, unimaginable, just in a way that I just think people couldn't wrap their heads around. And we have actually just recorded and we'll be releasing tomorrow a full-length episode on it on Red Handed. And I think one of the things that really felt like, why are people obsessed with this case? And I think it's because if you think about the scenario in which it happened, it's almost the perfect example of where this kind of thing shouldn't be happening. It's like 6 kids in a house in a very safe town. I believe Moscow, Idaho hadn't had a murder in 7 years before this massacre happened. The fact that actually all 4 of the victims were in bed with somebody else. So we were saying, I can't think of a situation in which you would feel more safe. If I was in a house that was my student house, I was in a small town where I probably knew most people because it's not a huge population and it's mainly students. I'm in bed with either my boyfriend or my best friend, and I know there's 5 other people in there. And I've just ordered, as one of them did, a food delivery, and I'm watching TikTok. It's almost just the destruction of total normality. And I think that's what was shocking for so many people. And honestly, since it happened, mainly since I read the probable cause affidavit, I would say I've been struggling to sleep and felt a bit uneasy because I'm just like, what if someone just came into my house and murdered me? That's what happened to them. And I think when you read the probable cause affidavit, I think the lines that stand out are what DM says of hearing somebody's voice saying, there's someone here. And I think we can all put ourselves in that position, and the fear is just overwhelming. And I think that's why everyone's been so caught up with this case. But that's just speaking from my perspective on it.
No, I think you're right though. I think home invasions that end in murders are so rare.
Yeah, you said that this is something that a lot of people will say, this isn't going to happen to me, or it's not going to happen to us. A lot of people don't even have that thought anymore. A lot of people don't even make that association. Even if you're watching a horror movie and it's a scene in that horror movie, it's become a movie. So that's not reality, and that's not going to happen to us. But it does happen, and it does speak to the psychological position that this perpetrator was in when they entered that home. Where does your head go when you think about the person who enters the home to do something like this and execute it once, twice, 3 times, over and over? It seemed like each attack was escalating. It didn't seem like there was any loss of energy. What's your thoughts on the psychological position that this person's in?
I mean, it's so, and again, I know all 4 of us do this for a living. We're meant to be thinking about what is the psychological makeup of a person like this? What could possibly be the motive? It's so hard to know. I do wonder if the person who did this was under the influence of something when they went in there. It felt very pre-planned. I know with the current suspect that they have, there's a lot of evidence that shows maybe he was there doing intel gathering and things like this. It seems like it was in some ways a highly organized crimes, but in other ways it seems really frenzied and really chaotic. I mean, there's a dog running around, there's a food delivery man turning up, literally 4 minutes they think before the murders started, if we say that it happened between 4:04 and 4:26, which seems to be the best estimate. And yeah, just the escalation. And did he not know that there were 6 people in the house? Surely he would have if he had been watching it like is suspected, which either shows that he's incredibly reckless, because if there was only one target, he was willing to go into a house that was full of people and he may have to commit multiple homicides, or he was happy to commit multiple homicides from the beginning. It's so hard to understand what was going through this person's mind. It's weird because half of it, like I said, points to a highly organized and half of it doesn't. Like the fact, if the leather sheath that they found in one of the victims' beds is related to the crime, who leaves that sheath behind? I've seen people holding up the exact same sheath and it's enormous. How do you forget that? And just going back there 4.5 hours later with your phone turned on, if it is this person, I don't know. It seems very mixed. In terms of being highly organized, but also seeming quite disorganized.
Thank goodness that sheath was left, because that's how they gathered DNA. And then they tracked him using forensic genetic genealogy, which I find incredible. We were talking on our subscription show last week, I think, how if these murders happened a few years ago, this would definitely still be unsolved, knowing that that was how the suspect was located and arrested. Although in reading the affidavit, it does seem like he was on the radar much earlier than I would have guessed.
Yeah, because when they first arrested Kohberger and people were asking the police department how was he arrested, they did say outright that it was thanks to IgG. I was definitely very excited because I believe if that had been the case, like it had been purely IgG in the way they caught like the Golden State Killer or the Bear Brook murders, for example, then I believe this would have been one of the first, if not the first time it had been used to capture somebody in a live and active investigation rather than closing cold cases. But then when the probable cause affidavit came out, it looked like it wasn't so much like with the Golden State Killer, for example, that they got the sample and they were running it constantly through these publicly searchable databases. And then they got a hit to a family member. Then they can build out a family tree, narrow down who it definitely couldn't be. Like, it's not going to be 85-year-old grandpa Dave who lives in Florida. So let's narrow it down to the people in the area, the right age, the right sex, that kind of thing. That's what I had thought, but it doesn't look like that's what happened. It looks like they found the DNA but had nothing to compare it to because Kohberger had never been arrested before. His DNA wasn't in the system. But then they saw the white Hyundai Elantra that had been caught on multiple CCTV cameras in the area. And then they obviously had his phone number. They were able to get the phone warrant search done and see that he had been in the area multiple times and that the car and the phone almost track exactly from the Washington State campus to King Road back to Pullman, which is where Kohberger obviously lived. And it all seemed to match the timeline of the killings. And during the time of the killings, the phone is switched off and the car is not caught on any CCTV because presumably it's not moving during that time. I think the shocking thing was then they go 2,500 miles away, test rubbish that's found outside the house of Kohberger, who's the suspect because of the car and the cell phone, and find that the male whose DNA is on that rubbish would be 99.9% chance match of being the biological father of the suspect profile found in the sheath. And just the fact that it was found on the other side of the country makes that even more compelling to me. And it was the place that they looked that they found it.
If it isn't Kohberger, I will be completely amazed.
Yeah.
Like, I don't, obviously, allegedly, but like, I just don't see how it cannot be him.
You know what's really interesting about this conversation is we're talking about matching through DNA. You just detailed a timeline, distances, and the whole progression of the investigation. And I couldn't help think about the O.J. Simpson trial and how there was literally a blood trail from the crime scene on his car leading back to his person on his hand. And they used DNA, but it was used to get him off.
Yeah.
It was used to say it's 98% accurate, but there's that 2%. You never know. So it's funny that our conversation has changed.
Oh, absolutely. And I think now, if anything, the danger is, and that's what we wanted to make sure in the episode we were recording, or at least what was conscious in my head. We don't want to say there has to be DNA because obviously they're taking apart the car now. They've seized his white Hyundai and they'll be taking it apart no matter how much he thinks he's cleaned it. If he is the killer, they will find something unless he put down plastic sheeting all over that car. And even then he could have missed something. If it's there, they're going to find it. But at the same time, I also want to be careful with that commentary or that narrative, because then it could really kick us in the face in future crimes where people are like, well, there wasn't any DNA there, so how do you know he did it? Since the O.J. Simpson trial, I think juries, the public, lay people, we've all become much more au fait with DNA. But I think now you see the flip side of it, where if there isn't any DNA, if there isn't any CSI magic forensics, then people are like, well, he can't be guilty because you didn't find anything. And that's also dangerous. For example, we covered the Scott Peterson case. We did a 2-parter on that in December. That was our last case of 2022. I 100% think Scott Peterson killed Lacey Peterson and Connor Peterson. I have no doubt in my mind that that man is exactly where he should be. I was very relieved to see that he did not get a new trial granted to him, and I hope he spends the rest of his life in prison, and I don't care about him. No matter how much evidence you put forward to people that shows brick after brick after brick that builds this enormous wall of his guilt, people are like, but they didn't find any DNA. And I'm like, that's not the only thing that can convict somebody. And I think we are in danger of going too far, where without that, juries feel uncomfortable almost.
We'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsor.
And a thank you to our sponsors. Back to the program.
And Kohberger seemed like someone who was aware of the possibility of leaving prints. He was apparently wearing gloves in a supermarket afterwards.
I think he is one of those people whose ambition far exceeds their ability. I think he probably, obviously, was a PhD criminology student, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think he's this magical evil genius that the press have been making him out to be. I think that's being too kind. I think he probably thought that he was going to mastermind the whole thing and commit the perfect crime, but obviously was incapable of doing so and made some really, really fundamental mistakes.
Do you think that the media is like looking for a Hannibal Lecter?
I think they always are. I think that's one of the key things that we covered in the book as well, is that like it's very easy for us to think that people who commit multiple murders are not like us, that they are this other thing that is so monstrous and ununderstandable and like indescribable that we couldn't possibly get ourselves into that situation. But the reality is nobody goes around killing people for no reason.
I think it's also the idea, to your point, Lance, that we have absolutely got a culture. You know, I'm not here to be like, oh, this is so wrong. It's always been the case. This isn't like a modern phenomenon, but this kind of glamorization, right, of serial killers. That even feels like hacky to say now because it's so over discussed. But what I also mean about it is this kind of romanticization of them as being hyper intellectual, being omnipotent, being these kind of grand chess master level geniuses who are always 10 steps ahead of the police and everybody else. And I think that comes obviously from like entertainment. It comes from Hollywood, it comes from books, it comes from serial killer movies, those kind of things, in which if the serial killer isn't those things, then why would anybody watch it? Because it's not very interesting to have a cat and mouse game where the mouse is stupid. When the media then got their hands on someone like Bryan Kohberger, when they found out that he was a PhD in criminology, it was just like all of their dreams come true, because it was implying that he was this man who was this mega genius who had somehow got this secret backdoor knowledge into how to get away with crimes. And then you find out that he drove his own car there, if it is him, obviously, that he took his cell phone with him and turned it off during just the hour of the murders, and that he left a sheet there with his DNA on it. So no, he's not a genius. Very few of these people are. I think what we always say is when you think about multiple serial killers, I know Bryan Kohberger, he's not been proven to do this, and even that wouldn't make him a serial killer, but they typically kill people that they have no connection to, which makes it very hard for law enforcement to investigate. And if you spend all of your time fixating on one thing, like how you were going to get away with killing a bunch of people, then anyone could be reasonably good at it and with luck get away with it for a little while. Doesn't make him a genius, and it doesn't make any of them geniuses. Ted Kaczynski is probably the closest we'd get to a genius, and he was found in a shed, grubby and with no food in there. So like, I don't know, in what way are we calling them geniuses, you know?
Yeah, but Ted Kaczynski chose to do that. I just want your opinion on this. We're talking about how this individual's not a genius, but as a parent of one of those people who were murdered that night in that fashion, that doesn't matter to them.
No, of course not.
Like, they don't care if he wasn't a genius or is a genius. How do true crime consumers make that delineation between looking at the crime itself, reading the documents, wanting to understand the individual, and then having to humanize the family?
I think it comes down to the fact of there's nothing wrong with being interested in this story or in crimes like this. There's nothing wrong with that at all. You know, we all make a living talking about true crime. So I would always say there is nothing wrong with it. There is nothing grotesque about having an interest in it. Even the media now talking about like, oh, criminology, this, that, and the other. I'm like, no, like there's nothing perverse about any of this. What I would say is the ethical consumption of it comes from respecting the victims and the way in which people talk about them, and also understanding who the victims are. Frankly, some of the bullying of the survivor, DM in particular, has just been completely unbelievable to read and like really, really sad to see. And I think with regards to the families, it's the same. And I think most people have the level of empathy that they know what lines not to cross. I think the bigger danger is these internet sleuths and people who think that they are doing quote unquote investigating, when I would always say, unless you are a police officer working on that case, you're not investigating anything. You're simply researching and reading what's already out there. You're not generating new lines of inquiry, for example, and you don't have all of the information. But them pointing the finger at various people and destroying lives. This case only happened 8 weeks ago. I don't know if you guys saw, I'm sure you did, like the accusations that were hurled first at Kaylee Goncalves' ex-boyfriend. I was shocked by the number of media outlets that were naming him, putting his picture on their, nightly broadcast, even to just say, oh, should we have suspicions about this person? It was so unethical to me. And I think that's the real unethical side of it. I don't think having an interest, reading this probable cause affidavit, being interested in the psychology of this killer, why he did it, why he did these things, I just do not think there is anything wrong with this at all. I think people are naturally going to be interested. It would be hard not to be, but don't go around pointing the finger at people. You don't know what you're talking about. We even now don't have all the information, and people are going after DM. We don't know for sure what even happened, and people blaming her for going back into the room and closing the door. I find it hard to believe anyone to say what they would do in that situation, though I will tell you for nothing that if I was her, I would have gone back into my room and shut the door and hoped and prayed to have survived that and done whatever I had to do to not be murdered, if that's what she even knew was happening. So no, I think the ethical side of it is just that even some of the families seem to have been facing harassment from the public, which is unbelievable. That's a whole nother conversation to get into the mind of those people who would cyber bully victims of the families of victims of this kind of massacre. I don't understand it at all.
Yeah, I think in terms of delineation between like looking at the crime and then empathizing towards the families, I don't think it's that hard. It's just don't be a dick. We discuss it so much in the true crime space, like how to ethically do it. I don't think it's difficult. I think it's just like, don't make jokes about things that aren't fucking funny, and like be an empathetic human being. I don't think those are difficult things to achieve.
You totally nailed it. I mean, we totally always overthink that ethical line when it's so easy. You know when you've gone over a line. You know it. You know when someone else has.
It is obvious. I think there's no shame in interest, but don't be a dick and leave the families alone. Leave the survivors alone. It's just mind-boggling to me.
Get a job. Like, how much time do you have?
And these people who feel it's somehow their role in life to bully this. I mean, obviously she's 20, but I'm going to say she's a girl because when I was 20, I would consider myself that. Like, to bully this girl on the internet, it is crazy. And even if you, as a person who is doing this, don't give a shit about the empathetic side of this, you think that this person does deserve to be bullied for what they did, then at least think about it from the practical standpoint, because she presumably is the only one who saw this person, this killer, from the evidence that we have at the moment. We need, and by we, I mean the prosecution, the FBI, the people investigating this crime, who are going to spend now the next 12 months probably building a case to go to trial, need DM to cooperate, need her to tell them the truth about what she heard in the house, what she saw in the house, and what she did and what she didn't do. And if she becomes scared to open her mouth or to tell the truth because of the backlash she's scared she's going to receive on the internet, and she stops talking or she starts lying to protect herself now, then how does that help these people who say what they want is justice for those 4 victims? Like, shut the hell up. There are so many ramifications to these kind of things, not just ethically in an emotional sense, but also practically as well.
DM, like, going back into the room could have saved her life. The suspect went back to the location the next morning before the police were even called.
Exactly. So people being like, well, why didn't she go out? Well, he was back there at 9 o'clock, 9:30. And yes, she didn't know this, or maybe she did. I don't know. As for the question, like, I don't know if he saw her, because it's not that obvious in the probable cause affidavit whether Brian Koberger or whoever it was, whoever the person in the house was, I guess I should say, saw DM or not. She says that she sees him, but he just walks out of the door. She did exactly the right thing.
I think the nature of the crimes suggests that if he had seen her, we would be having a different conversation about DM.
That's why I think maybe he didn't see her. If she just cracked her door open to look outside and she saw him, then maybe he didn't see her at all. Because yeah, you're right. It does make sense that why would he leave her alive?
Also, it's completely ridiculous for people to criticize anybody for going back into their room and locking the door. You don't know if there's 20 people out there.
And also, there's no proof that she even knew what was happening.
What the hell was happening? Yeah.
They'd all been drinking that day. That's no judgment. They're students, they're young people, like of course they are. 4:30 in the morning, she's woken up by sounds, but there's like a doorbell going off with a food delivery turning up, the dog's barking, like there's all sorts of crazy noise. And we have this thing called like normalcy bias, right? Where people, when they are being bombarded with stimuli like this or seeing things like this, they will want to think that it is something that can be explained away. Her mind's not going to jump to, oh my God, there's someone in the house and everyone's been murdered. She may just have thought it's some guy that one of the girls hooked up with and he's leaving, or it was a friend or something. We don't even know what she thought. And I know they said in the probable cause affidavit that she was frozen in shock or something. We made this point that those probable cause affidavits are also written to get an arrest. We don't know what actually happened and whether she even realized and put two and two together as to what had happened. Because why would she? That's such a crazy thing to think, that everyone had just been murdered.
You mentioned this case is keeping you up at night. What specifically is keeping you up?
Do you know what? I think it's the feeling of when you look at this case, you listen to it, you think about it, you read the probable cause affidavit of one of the girls saying there's someone here. And I think it's putting yourself in those victims' shoes and thinking about how unbelievably scared all of them and DM must have been that night. And I think that's what makes me feel uneasy, is that how particularly Xana Kernodle, who we assume is probably the last one to have died given DM's testimony, the fact that she just got food delivered after a night out, it's 4:00 and I can't stop imagining her in bed with her boyfriend next to her, who's not a small guy, in a house filled with her friends, like we said, on TikTok eating a takeaway, and suddenly there's a man in your room who has got a knife. Like, I think it's just that crazy juxtaposition of complete normality smashed together with the most absurd thing you could think of happening. And I think that's what freaks me out. It could just happen in a second like it did to them.
I am very disturbed by Koberger being a criminology student and wondering if this is some kind of like research or something. That keeps me up, wondering who's consuming what and what they're going to do in the future.
While I don't think it's irrelevant that he was a criminology student, I also do think, do we really think that people like Bundy and BTK and all of these like killers in the past weren't reading about and consuming everything they could about previous killers and reading about them and learning about them? We've seen from multiple school shooters in particular that when they've searched their rooms, they have found that they were obsessively reading about previous killers and they had an obsession with it. And I think that just because he took his into the academic sphere, I think that came with his narcissistic personality, that I think he wanted to be an expert in something. I think he couldn't sort of excel maybe socially in other areas. So I think he thought, I can do this academically. And I think he just picked a subject he liked and that would allow him to research the thing he was most interested in. But I think all killers probably definitely research these things to a massive extent. They maybe just don't take it into the classroom. And also we have to say that even if you are obsessed with those things and spend all your time reading about it, doesn't make you a killer. This just happened to be what he chose to do.
It's a really good point, and it actually makes me feel a little bit better about the whole psychology behind him, because at least that put him in front of people, or it would put somebody like him in front of other people that would recognize that. I was thinking, well, what if it's a mailman who knows where you live and knows your patterns and is secretly researching all of this and comes really out of nowhere? I think him wanting to be an academic probably wasn't the best choice for him. Like you said, his ego sort of bit him in the ass there.
But they used to say, like, a psychopath doesn't know they're a psychopath. Like, this guy did.
And I think there is a lot of concentration on the fact he was doing a PhD in criminology. He'd only done one semester. One of the things we talk about often is that the character of Hannibal Lecter is really unrealistic, because there's no way an actual psychopath would be told what to do by people he thought were less intelligent than him for the amount of years it takes to be a doctor. Like, it's pretty unrealistic. Maybe he wouldn't have completed his PhD even if he had stuck it out.
I think that's the thing, is that he could absolutely be a psychopath. We know that the statistics show that lawyers, doctors, CEOs, they do actually show higher levels of psychopathy than the average person. So they can sit it out in education, but not one that has dark desires or violent fantasies. And presumably, if whoever this killer was, if it is Koberger, those violent fantasies would have been there from much earlier. I mean, he's not that old. He's 28, which maybe a little bit older than you'd expect for a first kill, but we don't know. I know the Pennsylvania police are now looking back at previous unsolved crimes to see if he did do anything else there that he got away with. And I know these are unverified, but I've also seen reports that people have found of him having posted as like a 17-year-old on the internet talking about headaches he was having, something he calls like visual snow or something, and almost sounds like whiteouts or blackouts or something. So, you know, people are now falling into that trap of, could we have stopped him? And I'm like, no, you couldn't. These things happen, and they are terrifying and absolutely awful and unbelievably traumatic for everybody involved. What red flags would you have been looking for? He was a weird guy who got flagged in like bars that he went to for being inappropriate with women and stuff like that. I think him studying criminology, all of that, we suggested, you know, one of the motives that it could be, other than just the fact that he wanted to kill people. And if, say, Kaylee was the target, because it looks like maybe they were killed first, her and Maddie, because it makes more sense that he started upstairs and came downstairs. But was this because he wanted to be the expert in one particular crime? Was it because he wanted to be able to offer some unbelievable insights into the infamous unsolved Idaho student murders case, and he would be the only one to be able to do it? And he'd have a PhD in criminology, so people would have to take him seriously. It's hard to know. All we can do is speculate. The thing I find the most troubling is the shattering of that completely normal house.
And it's kind of a dangerous path to go down when you're talking about identifying these markers or these characteristics of individuals and saying this is a little odd, so is this suggestive of them being a homicidal maniac in 5 years? You can't start classifying and placing judgment on people for being a little odd, because maybe this might happen.
If he didn't have violent fantasies, then he would have just been an odd guy, whoever did this. Like, that's it.
We had a woman on who wrote a book with a psychiatrist who was James Holmes' psychiatrist, the Aurora, Colorado movie theater shooter. She was his psychiatrist before he shot up that theater. She couldn't do anything because he never specifically gave a plan. He said that he had fantasies about people's lives being value to him, where he would gain value by taking people's lives. But that was like, he never went over that line to say, and by doing that, I'm going to kill a lot of people in a movie theater. It's just a really, really fine line there before you're able to say, all right, this is a dangerous person.
Absolutely. And I think that's why with Koberger, if it is him, we've had people come out saying that they knew him, they were classmates with him, all of the things in isolation, like his classmates saying this, women he'd been on dates with in the past saying certain things. Even if you put them all together, they don't paint a picture of anything other than a socially inept individual. Maybe in his apartment, they'll find journals that explain more about his motivations. But I just think, yeah, there's no way this could have been stopped. And that's probably what also makes it even more terrifying.
Thank you so much for spending some time with us today. We really appreciate it. That was a great conversation.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. This was great. It's always good to speak to you guys. And yeah.
See you at the show.
Yeah.
Give another plug for your show.
Red-Handed is, if people want another true crime podcast to add to their list if they've never listened before, it's just me and Hannah talking about a different crime every week. You should check it out.
You two are so humble. Oh, you should check it out. It's a really good show, and people need to listen to it. I think you're being a little too. I think you're being a little too. humble.
American.
We're just being very British about it.
I've always wanted to ask: do you ever pretend that somebody's on the phone when you take the pictures with the red phone? Who do you think is on the phone?
It's my mum asking if I want to go to Car Giant.